Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Kaffeepause, our regular check-in with a Berlin-based journalist to talk about the stories shaping the headlines. Today, we're joined by Marc Felix Serrao. He has served as the head of the Berlin office since 2017 and the editor-in-chief of the Neue Züricher Zeitung in Germany since 2021. Hallo Felix, herzlich willkommen.
Hello, Stephen. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So, Felix, I'm really looking forward to our conversation because, as you know, I generally like to start the Kaffeepause by asking about the political mood in Berlin and in Germany more broadly. And I think that makes special sense today, given that we're 3 weeks after the federal election and ahead of a very important vote on 3 constitutional amendments in the Bundestag tomorrow. So, Felix, in broad brushstrokes, what's the mood like at the moment in Berlin?
The mood could probably best be described by anxious. So what we'll be seeing tomorrow in the National Parliament and then later on in the week in the Federal Council is the biggest movement towards burdening the state budget with billions that this country has ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
Even those who are generally in favor of what the Bundestag is about to decide on are a bit nervous because it's the time frame where all this has been set up was very, very tight. Many members of parliament, and again, even those who are generally in favor of what's about to happen, have said they've hardly had enough time to really look at what is being planned. So yes, it's a very exciting, I would say, historic week in German politics.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's fair to say that when the traffic light coalition, when the Ampel collapsed on November 6th, it really had a lot to do with financing and finances. And so obviously that has dominated the debate since then. We're in sort of an interesting period where Olaf Scholz is still leading a caretaker government and the outgoing Bundestag is still in parliament and the new Bundestag has not come in yet. So the clock is ticking. With the current makeup of the parliament, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens have a 2/3 majority in order to change the Constitution and introduce these amendments. That won't be the case when the new parliament meets. And I guess the new parliament has to meet by March 25th. So that gives a sense of the urgency. But can you talk a little bit about some of the events sort of behind the scenes in terms of how this new package came about? We're talking about almost 1 trillion euro in new debt over the next decade to boost Germany's defense, but also to bolster the economy with major investments in infrastructure as well. How did we sort of get to this point?
Right. So I think the one thing that all established German parties have agreed upon before the election is that Germany needs to really amp up its defense spending. So there's no disagreement here. The discussion starts on what would be the best way to do this in the regular state budget or using a so-called Sondervermögen, which is really a tricky word because it's national debt. You know, it's not a wealth of the state. But so the first thing the CDU, the CSU, and the Social Democrats, after starting talks after the election, agreed upon was, okay, we have to do something here now. And here's where it got tricky for Friedrich Merz the very likely next German chancellor for the first time, because the only party that he has a majority with to form a government are the Social Democrats, because with the Green Party, he doesn't get enough votes in the parliament. So he's bound to this one partner. The Social Democrats, knowing this, said, okay, let's do this regarding defense spending, but let's add something, and that is the so-called Sondervermögen for infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, you and I would agree, is new roads, new railroads, school buildings, and so forth. But the discussion very quickly became more broad when Friedrich Merz realized he needs the Green vote to get the Grundgesetz, the change of the Grundgesetz before the new parliament is in office. So infrastructure in then the next round of discussion became everything and nothing. The youth organization of the CDU had a, I think, very funny phrase for what this Sondervermögen infrastructure is now. They said everything but pet food. So now supporting of battling climate change is also part of this Sondervermögen infrastructure. At first, Friedrich Merz offered the Green Party 50 billion out of that Sondervermögen, so every 10th euro. He told them in the parliament, what else do you want? Well, the Greens wanted more. So Friedrich Merz is now offering up 100 million. So every 5th euro that was supposed to go into the German infrastructure that needs to be modernized is now going into battling climate change. And that again is a very broad term. So this is his dilemma. He has promised the German public a real political change. He said on the day before the election, there's no left majority anymore. We're not going to make politics for green lunatics. Well, Annalena Baerbock, still the foreign secretary, said on Friday, this is a new chapter in green politics. Mm-hmm. So Friedrich Merz has promised a change that he finds now very hard to deliver. That's where we're at. That's his dilemma.
So it's been really interesting to see this unfold, because as you correctly point out, the only way that these changes can go through is if these three parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens, are all on board with it. And so Friedrich Merz has had to negotiate with the Social Democrats, and we'll come back to some of those negotiations as well, because I'd like to ask how the coalition talks in general are doing. But the Greens were also able to apply some pressure, as you just indicated, and get a little bit more out of this deal. An agreement was reached on Friday when all the sides came together, and the vote is supposed to take place tomorrow in the Bundestag. I guess one question about that is, do you expect the vote to pass? Because one of the things that I've been hearing is that although the combination of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Greens have 32 votes over the 2/3 majority that they need in order to get this through, not everybody from each of those three parties is going along with it. A number of Bundestag members, particularly from the Christian Democrats, who were not reelected, partly because of the change in the electoral laws, have said that they won't vote for this because they feel that they are putting debt onto future generations. Others have said that they would call in sick tomorrow when the vote comes through. Do you expect the planned changes to go through, or what's happening today behind the scenes to make sure that those votes are solid?
So there are a number of members of parliament where no pressure can be applied because they're leaving parliament. And a few have already announced that they will vote no. For example, the former Secretary General of the Christian Democratic Union, Mario Chaya. who had a falling out with Friedrich Merz. I would assume that they will get the majority because the number of the members of parliament from the CDU is fairly small. That will not be in the next parliament, and Social Democrats and or Greens who will not be in the next parliament will probably find it very hard to explain to their party and the public why they helped prevent, such a social democratic and left-wing project with such a dimension. The argument will be made, well, why won't you help repair German roads and railroads and school buildings? So I think it will go through on Tuesday. It'll be exciting, but they'll probably be missing a couple of votes. I think the decisive day is then on Friday, because to change the Grundgesetz, you need the 2/3 majority first in the national parliament, then in the federal council. And there, those state governments where the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and the Social Democrats are ruling, they don't added together, they don't get the 2/3 majority. There are a number of governments where the Linkspartei, the left-wing party, or the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht are part of the government. You never know how they will decide. Officially, they are against increasing defense spending, but it's open, and it may end up coming down to the vote of Bavaria, where the CSU of Markus Söder has a government with the Freie Wähler, which is a party that is really only relevant in some German states. They have tried again, but failed to become a serious actor on the national level. But their party leader, Hubert Aiwanger, has publicly said he's not happy about the whole project. He actually thinks the debt brake is a good idea, but the pressure is, of course, very high, and many members of his own party, they are also applying pressure to him because they want the money, for their constituents. So I wouldn't bet an expensive bottle of wine, but I would probably bet that he will, in the end, vote in favor.
Okay. And there have also been some questions about whether these amendments are constitutional. There was some reporting about that last week, and I guess over the weekend I saw that the Free Democrats have gone to the Constitutional Court questioning the legitimacy of these amendments. Can you talk a little bit about the arguments against this from a constitutional standpoint?
So there are basically, as if I understood it correctly, two legal arguments against forcing this decision this week. One, that the old parliament cannot make such far-reaching decisions when a new parliament has already been elected and could have already been opened. AfD and left the Linkspartei alone could have forced the new government to be opened, but the Linkspartei said they wouldn't push something together with the AfD. But there, the majority of law experts in these matters, Staatsrechtler, from what I've read, agree that there's no such thing as an interregnum where the old parliament cannot make any decisions. They are still fully operational and they can do this. So from a legal standpoint, it seems to be pretty clear. From a political standpoint, I think one might disagree. And then the other legal question was whether this was too ambitious a time frame, whether members of parliament had enough time to really look into what they're about to decide. But the court, Karlsruhe, as so far, been with the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats, and they've denied all these requests.
Mm-hmm. So Felix, assuming that this goes through, I think one of the big questions is whether the incoming government, presumably under the leadership of Friedrich Merz, will be able to put this money to good use. And how are people thinking about the spending in the short and midterm? I mean, granted, this is a long-term commitment of about a decade. But in the short term, there needs to be some mobilization very, very quickly to try to spend these funds.
Right. Well, let me just say, add one thing. The amount that Germany is willing to spend on defense is still to be decided, because the only change there in the Grundgesetz is that there will be an exception from the debt brake for any amount of money spent on defense that goes above 1% of the GDP. So that could be then 2%, 3%. This discussion in NATO is ongoing, but it's open, and it's completely open where exactly that money would be spent. So what Friedrich Merz and many others have rightly argued, that here is the biggest urgency, that there might be a military escalation in the near future, and Germany is so far unprepared. There we have a big question mark. We don't know how much money the new government is willing to spend, and we don't know on what. Now, regarding infrastructure, money will be spent quickly, and I think one of the first effects we will see, and many economists warn we'll see this, is a rise in inflation, because we already have a so-called Fachkräftemangel, so we don't have enough qualified workers. Now, if all of a sudden there's such a high demand, of course the prices there will rise. Prices for housing will rise. Your mortgage rates will go up. So this is probably the first effect we'll see, probably in the short term. And of course, now investing in infrastructure is a decade-long project. So we'll see, some things happening on roads or on railroads, but before the Deutsche Bahn is on time again, that will take another 10 years.
Mm-hmm. In terms of maybe sort of short-term activities, one of the things that I did read was that with this deal likely to go through, it makes it much easier for the outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz to commit another 3 billion in German funding to Ukraine. That the likelihood is that this will go towards ammunition, rockets, drones, even fighter jets, but also training, as a clear sign that Germany and its European partners want to stand by Kiev, want to continue to support Ukraine, even at a time when American support is being called into question.
Right. I mean, he's always been hesitant to do this, to submit this money. I haven't, but I've actually been so focused on the Grundgesetzänderung tomorrow and on Friday that I haven't read anything about a new position from him in recent days. But if he doesn't allow for this, then surely Friedrich Merz wants in office, and he wants to be in office in late April, approximately on the 23rd. This probably be one of the first things that he'll take care of.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the coalition negotiations. How realistic do you think it is that a new government could be in place as quickly as April 23rd?
I mean, there are still quite a few issues that both sides find it really hard to disagree on. Migration policy is one. So, for example, pushbacks on the national border. This is something that Friedrich Merz has promised to do. On the first day in office, he'll say he will make the Minister of the Interior order German federal police to push back anyone entering the country illegally, even if they call for a political asylum. This would be new. Now in the Sondierungspapier, so in this paper that was first published after the initial talks with the Social Democrat, there is an interesting phrase where they say they will only do this in Übereinstimmung, so in accordance with European partners. So if Austria and Poland and the Netherlands protest, one could argue then Germany won't do this. Now in CDU, many say, no, we will do this. This is only a first step. So we'll try and convince our partners that they will go along, but if they don't, we'll still do it. Now, this might be a tricky one because Lars Klingbeil for the Social Democrats has said again and again, this is a red line for him. We won't do this. We won't alienate our European partners, especially in this, geopolitical climate, not with us. So yes, there are, and this is just one example, there are still some issues where it's not easy to imagine what a good compromise could look like. Another one is the internal pressure on Friedrich Merz to really bring about economic reform as well, and some cuts in the regular state budget, because many voters of the party, there was a public outcry. They say, this is deception. You've said this and now you're doing this. We voted for political change and are always seeing our social democratic and green projects. Where is the CDU? Where is the center-right politics? The pressure on Friedrich Merz in the upcoming, the already ongoing coalition talks is really quite high. He has to show something to his party and the party base. But the one question mark I would see is on the timeline. So he wants to be in office shortly after Easter. Now, if you look at the number of people involved in the coalition talks, it sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. I think it's 250 or so people in a dozen and a half working groups looking at minute details. And that's the one side. On the other side, they promised to not repeat the mistake by the Ampel coalition to have this huge coalition contract. They want to keep it, nice and small and compact. We'll see. It might take a little longer than planned.
I mean, coming back to the opening topic, I would think that with some of the financing issues out of the way, with the new Sondervermögen and loosening of the debt brake, as will hopefully be approved by the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, some of the stickier issues for the coalition negotiations are sort of removed, right? I mean, the financing issues are basically covered by what's going on at the moment. Technically or theoretically, that should make coalition negotiations between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats a little bit easier. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are sticking points like migration policy and a big task for the next government, how one jumpstarts the economy. But the optimist in me seems to think that it might be a little easier to find common denominators. Is that what you're hearing, or do you think these sticking points will be severe?
I think the latter, because Friedrich Merz is in such a weak spot for the negotiation because he has no alternative to a coalition with the Social Democrats. He said he won't risk the first German minority government on a national level. He said that, of course, he won't do anything with the AfD. And he has said it in such terms that it would really break his neck if he were to change his mind, plus his party wouldn't go along. So he's stuck with the Social Democrats, and now why should they cave in? They know this, and there is, I mean, if it all were to fail, there's still the possibility, the theoretical possibility of a minority government that is purely left wing. So Linke Partei, the Green Party, and the Social Democrats. Some argue this would be a more likely scenario than a minority government by the CDU and CSU alone. Or, you know, if all falls apart, you may end up having new elections, where I'm pretty sure that CDU and CSU would really be punished, because all they have to show for until now is the willingness to do what the SPD and the Greens ask of them. So it's really he maneuvered himself into a very tricky spot, and the Social Democrats know it.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that gives them a stronger negotiating position. One more question about the coalition agreement and the coalition talks. I mean, in the past, coalition agreements have basically been like work plans for an incoming government in terms of here's our to-do list and here's how we're going to go about fulfilling these goals. Obviously, the coalition agreement of the traffic light coalition was upset by the conflict in Ukraine and everything that brought with it. I've heard a number of different comments from people about this coalition agreement looking different, being smaller, more compact, as you said. How do you think that might affect governing? I mean, I've heard different things. One is let's just agree on the topics that we want to work on, or let's put together a coalition for our agreement for our first year working together rather than for the 4 years. What are you hearing about what this shorter coalition agreement could look like?
So I haven't heard any timeline as like, let's just talk about the first year. What I've heard in very broad strokes is, you know, we'll keep it compact and small, not as detailed. It's too early in the coalition talks to really say what direction this is going, so I wouldn't want to try it. I think if we were to have this discussion in 2 or 3 weeks, we'd know a little more.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's like I said, you know, some more than 250 people are involved, and there's for each working group there is a leadership by one member of the CDU-CSU and by one from the SPD. Some of these names, when you read them, you know they get along. Others, you know, are really political foes. So we'll see.
So let's maybe, you know, stick with German politics a little bit, and some of the party politics and some of the cast of characters that are worth watching. We've been talking mostly about the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. Obviously, Friedrich Merz is sort of most likely he's the presumptive next chancellor of Germany. But one of the things that I was hearing in terms of people to watch is the name Jens Spahn, who under Chancellor Merkel was health minister. It looks like he might be tapped to take over as party chair, Fraktionsvorsitzende of the CDU. What are you hearing about people like Jens Spahn and other sort of leadership people that we should be watching, or who we should be watching?
So I mean, Jens Spahn is definitely, although he's still a very young man, I think he's about my age, but he has, among the inner circle of Friedrich Merz, he has the most experience on the national level. So he's been a member of the cabinet during Angela Merkel's time. And this is also a point that people who are close to him make. You know, there's no one in the CDU that has this much political experience. His problem is that there are many from his state, from North Rhine-Westphalia, that are pushing for senior posts. And in Germany, maybe your listeners are not aware of this, but regional proportions are very, very important. So it's not so so much, what you're good at, but it's at least as important where you're from. And North Rhine-Westphalia, the most populous German state, also has, of course, it's the biggest party organization. Those CDU NRW is the most important, the most influential, but there's also most of the senior aides to Friedrich Merz are from there. For example, Carsten Linnemann, the Secretary General, he's very likely to get a senior post. The same goes for Thorsten Frey. He's also, in the inner circle. Now the CDU has a notorious problem for outstanding female politicians. There's a lack. So one name you hear very often is Karin Prehn, who's Minister for Education in the state of Schleswig-Holstein in the north. She'll probably join the national cabinet. So Jens Spahn, if he doesn't end up being a member of the government, I think he has a fairly good chance. So I think it's probably 50-50. He'll probably be the whip in the parliament. He's one of the best public speakers the party has. So yeah, I think we'll definitely see a senior role for him. Whether it's in the government itself, I don't know.
And then what about within the Social Democrats? You did talk briefly about Lars Klingbeil, who's the Secretary General of the party. Of course, we've all heard about Boris Pistorius, the defense minister. It is highly likely that Pistorius will have a position within the new coalition government. Do you think that Klingbeil might make that transition to the government as well?
I would assume so, that he will get a senior role. I'm not sure that Boris Pistorius, I'm not sure whether he wants to stay in his current post. Neither am I sure that he could, even if he would. He's popular. But the CSU, from what I hear, are really eager to have this post. And there are a number of names already floating around. Boris Pistorius is, that he lost the power struggle with Olaf Scholz for the top candidate for the election, and he might lose now, to Lars Klingbeil. I don't know whether I hear that he might be interested in another cabinet post. But from what I hear, it's still such a whisper that I don't want to say it in public. Maybe there is a surprise there. Maybe, because, many of the discussions that you see are intertwined. One is on topics such as migrations, others are on personnel. So we may end up seeing a deal where the SPD stays in the defense ministry. But from right now, I think it is not likely that we'll see him on that post in the next government.
And I think it seems like it's a little bit too early to think about which party might get the leadership of which ministry, right? That's still what's going on in the behind closed doors talks about the coalition, and which ressort, which area goes to which group.
You hear, of course, you hear there are so many shadow cabinet lists going around, but I think it's too early to really say this is substantial now. Many of those rumors, however, make sense. So if you take, for example, Carsten Linnemann, who I've mentioned already, one of the posts that people say he may end up getting is a labor minister, so Arbeits- und Sozial Ministry, because this is in the state budget, it's the biggest chunk. So work and social, Arbeit und Soziales, is, I think it's almost a third of the state budget. And here many economists argue this is where you could really make some really substantial cuts. Now, if you give this ministry to the SPD again, to Hubertus Heil, He will do everything in his power to prevent that. Someone like Carsten Linnemann, who I wrote a piece on him a couple of years ago, claiming he was the last Ordnungspolitiker from the CDU. But he has been he's always been very outspoken for liberal, classical liberal fiscal policy. He's been in favor of the debt brake. So I think he's already also because of that right now in a lot of pain because of his party has agreed to. So that would make sense for me. If CDU and CSU really now have to show their parties that they are able to push for some center-right reforms, having a guy like that at that ministry would make sense.
Yeah. There are two parties, of course, that did not make it over the 5% hurdle, the Free Democrats and the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, or the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. And there's a lot going on within those two parties, too. Christian Lindner is no longer the head of the Free Democrats. It looks like Christian Dürer will take over. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Wants to take over.
Or sorry, what's that?
He wants to take over.
That he wants to take over. Okay, he's put his hat in the ring to take over. I'd love to get your thoughts on what's going on within the FDP, but also within the BSW. Obviously, they're out at the federal level. They were never in at the federal level. They do have a role to play in state governments in the East. Are we seeing this as the beginning of the end of the era of BSW?
It's too early to say because they only just missed the 5% hurdle by a little more than 10,000 or so votes.
Yeah.
They also went to Karlsruhe because of that. They wanted to, count the votes again. They lost at the court, but it was really very, very close, much closer than in the case of the FDP.
Yes.
But it's a party with a lot of problems because, in those states where the party joined the government, the leadership has, there have been public quarrels with Frau Wagenknecht, who has a very top-down approach to politics. And then there's her husband, Oscar Lafontaine, in the background, pulling the strings, which is something many people in the party have a problem with. So it's the future is open, of course. But I wouldn't be surprised if BSW would implode in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as we come to a close, I'd like to maybe take a step back. Obviously, what's going on in Berlin is being watched across Europe as Europe sort of struggles for leadership and deals with an evolving geopolitical environment. I happened to be in Germany when Friedrich Merz held his big foreign policy speech at the end of January before the election. And I found it interesting that he talked about sort of shoring up trust with Germany's neighbors in France and Poland, first and foremost. The relationship with the United States came much further down in his list, and he's actually spoken more recently about making Europe more independent from the United States. How much German leadership do you think is expected by Europe, and can Friedrich Merz fulfill that role?
I think there's a discrepancy on what Europe expects from Germany and what people in Berlin think the rest of Europe expects from Germany. So I think Germany, when you read polls either by Pew or by the European Council on Foreign Affairs and others, you see that Germany these days has a rather good reputation among other Europeans. It is seen as a reliable partner, one that really can help cross certain bridges between other member states. But when you look closely to these polls, there's never really a demand for political leadership in the true sense of the word. So Germany telling others in Europe what's the right way. And I would think that if Friedrich Merz, who has a tendency to be very outspoken and somewhat undiplomatic, goes about this too forcefully, there will be protest. I remember I was touring East and Southeast Europe a couple of years ago with Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer when she was still defense minister of Germany. And we were sitting in the garden of the German embassy in Prague, the famous embassy where Hans-Dietrich Genscher told the refugees from East Germany that they would now be allowed into West Germany. And we were sitting there with really very, very bright young students from the Czech Republic and other Eastern European countries. And the minister was discussing with them, European leadership. And one young Czech student said, Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, we here in the Czech Republic very often see ourselves as the 17th state of Germany. We like Germany. There's no hard feelings because of, Nazi crimes 80 years ago. But if you were to really push this German leadership thing, we would be up on our heels. This is not something we want. So I think Europe wants a present Germany, but not really German leadership in the traditional sense. And I also think that it is really those who argue that if the United States were to really put all their focus on the Pacific, and the last American soldier were to leave European soil, Europe wouldn't be the new West. Europe would still be heavily dependent on the United States when it comes to the military, if it's missile defense systems, if it's IT, if it's fighter jets, it's, drone technology. We're far from being, self-sufficient. And so I would argue that all this talk of the transatlantic divide, and Friedrich Merz said at one point, he compared, what is coming from the White House and what, J.D. Vance and Elon Musk supposedly interfering in the German election. He compared this to Russian propaganda and things coming from the Kremlin. I think that was just outrageous, to compare that. So it is a challenge for Europeans to come to terms with the Trump administration. But I think there's no alternative. This is the West. We have the same cultural heritage. We share the same ideas about branches of government and so forth. Federalism, individual rights, the rule of law. The separation of church and state. So we're a common, we're a united force. We shouldn't divide ourselves too quickly. And some of the remarks made by Friedrich Merz, I think, were disappointing in that regard, and he really has to watch out in the future.
Let me use that as a moment to sort of put in a plug for a new podcast that you're doing with your colleague Benedikt Neff. The Neue Züricher Zeitung has a podcast called Machtspiel, and in one of the recent podcasts, you talked about exactly this topic of the future of the West and where leadership is needed. And I think that could be very interesting to some of the people that regularly tune in to the Kaffeepause as well. Sorry, were you going to say?
Thank you for this little ad. I'd appreciate any interest coming from your listeners, but it's just one very short correction. It's not just Benedikt Neff and myself who are hosting this podcast. It's more colleagues. So I'm only on, I think, once a month on average.
Okay. But still, it's well worth tuning in for to listen to you and your colleagues talk about what's going on currently in German and global politics. If you have time, maybe one last question, and that is, I think it would be fascinating for us to get your take on how the United States is regarded in Berlin at the moment. Obviously, this is a critical time. I think many of us are aware of some of the recent public opinion polls that have seen a real rise in a lack of confidence and a lack of trust in the United States. But from your vantage point, dealing both with the political elites, but also sort of watching what the sentiments are on the ground, What's your sense of how the US is regarded at the moment?
I'm a little worried that the criticism in the wider German public it's really quite harsh. Many things, you know, that are being done and said by the Trump administration, one can be highly critical of. But this, at least this is my impression, by many is sort of put equal to, you know, the countries as a whole, you know, and our relationship with each other. You know, it's a narrative that I think one has to be very careful with. Friedrich Merz is not the only one who is blowing in that horn. And I think, you know, people who are fond of the transatlantic partnership and the ideas behind it really have to try very hard to work against this narrative. I think this is something we all need to keep in mind. But it's, you know, one thing that I think is promising is that, you know, when Friedrich Merz compared, you know, J.D. Vance and Elon Musk to Moscow, there was not a round of applause from his party. You know, I didn't see any other senior figure from the party, you know, repeat this nonsense. Others, so for example, Mr. Wadefuhl, who is, you know, the senior foreign policy figure from the party, have made much more moderate remarks, you know, saying that, you know, we'll do our very best to work to keep this partnership alive and running, and I think this is the right way to go.
Yeah. Well, Felix, herzlichen Dank. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for bringing us up to speed on what's going on in Berlin and in Germany at the moment. It's always wonderful to speak with you, and I hope we have an opportunity to do this again in the not too distant future.
Absolutely, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.